Good morning and welcome to the Morning Breath Livestream, where we start our day with coherence. I'm your host, Jeremy Tennell, systems designer and coherence coach. This is week 11, day 52 of our 14-week journey entitled The Path of Personal Transformation. And today, we're continuing our conversation on the dangers of the ego, as we will all week. Yesterday, we explored how the ego will gravitate towards any identity that grounds it. Today, we're looking at one of the most powerful and painful identities the ego can attach itself to: trauma. And I want to be very clear from the beginning. Trauma is real. What happened to people matters. The nervous system adapts to survive. The body stores stress. The mind creates patterns. The heart learns protection. This is not about dismissing pain. It's not about dismissing what happened to you. It's not about pretending suffering is imaginary, nor about blaming people for what they survived. But there is a tension here that we have to be willing to hold, because trauma may explain us without needing to define us. And healing eventually becomes our responsibility. Not because what happened to us was fair, but because we still have a life to live. We still have to live inside the life that remains. And the ego, if we're not careful, can take a real wound and slowly turn it into a permanent identity. Today's lesson is this, and this is important to remember. The ego is not a bad thing. It is a natural part of who you are. But the ego can be an incredibly deceptive intelligence. The ego does not always lie by saying something's false. Sometimes it lies by using a partial truth to keep us from a deeper truth. The partial truth may be, I was hurt. The deeper truth is, I still have to learn how to heal. The partial truth could be, the trauma shaped me. But the deeper truth is, I'm still responsible for. I learned to survive this way. And survival is not the same thing as freedom. This is where the ego becomes dangerous, because the ego can take a real wound and organize an entire false identity around it, not to heal it, but to protect it. I think many of us may have had moments where we realized the parts of our personality were actually adaptations, ways of surviving, ways of protecting ourselves, making it through environments where we did not feel safe. Maybe we became hyper aware, always reading the room, always anticipating tension or the next shoe to drop. Maybe we became independent, not because we didn't want love, but because depending on people felt dangerous. Maybe we became controlled, rigid, highly productive, always on, because slowing down would have forced us to feel what was underneath. And over time, those survival patterns can become identity. We stop saying, this is what I learned to do, and we start saying, this is who I am. That shift matters, because healing becomes difficult when the ego starts defending the adaptation of the self. And the ego is very clever here. It convinces us that releasing the pattern would somehow dishonor that pain. But healing is not dishonoring the wound. Healing is refusing to let the wound become the center of your identity forever. There is a profound difference between acknowledging trauma and identifying with. Acknowledging trauma says this happened to me. It affected me. It shaped me. It deserves care and attention, truth, and compassion. But egoic identification says, this happened to me. This is now who I am. That's the shift. And the ego often makes that shift feel invisible, because the ego knows how to use legitimate pain to preserve old patterns. The ego says, I'm protecting my peace, but sometimes we are avoiding accountability or difficult conversations. And trauma identity can become one of the strongest forms of egoic grounding. Ego doesn't have to be bold and loud. It doesn't have to be overconfident, because the wound is real and the memory happened. The nervous system response is normal, which means the ego can hide there very effectively. It can say, I am this way because of what happened. And then the ego quietly adds, therefore, I do not have to change. I deserve this pain. I get to hold on to who I am. That is the deception, not the trauma, the identification. The egoic path and the healing path can begin in the exact same place. Both begin with pain. Both begin with a moment, and both begin with recognition. But then the paths separate. The egoic path moves towards my wound is my identity. The healing path says my wound deserves care, but it is not the entirety. What I've been through matters, but I still need accountability, practice, relationship, and truth. The egoic path organizes life around protection, and the healing path organizes life around integration. And integration is difficult because healing often asks us to release patterns that once kept us alive. It's terrifying. The nervous system says, don't let go. But the ego says, this is who you are. Awareness begins to whisper when we let it. Maybe this was survival and not selfhood. And that whisper is where the transformation occurs. From a systems perspective, egoic trauma identity creates self-reinforcing loops, hermeneutic loops. The wound becomes identity. Identity shapes perception. Perception scans for threat. Threat activates the nervous system. Activation produces the defense behavior. The defensive behavior damages relationships. Damaged relationships reinforce the belief that the world is unsafe. And the ego says, see, I told you. This is why I have to stay this way. The loop feels true because the system keeps reproducing evidence for it. But coherence interrupts that loop. Awareness disrupts the automatic story. Breath engages activation. Regulation calms reaction. And slowly, the system learns that survival is no longer the only mode of being. Culturally, we are living in a time where trauma language has become widespread. And in many ways, that has been necessary. People needed language for what they carried. People needed to understand that their reactions had history. People needed to know that they were not simply broken. At no point in this culture's history has the language and the understanding of historic, family, personal trauma been so well documented and understood. But every language can eventually become an egoic lexicon if we're not careful, because the ego wants to turn trauma into status and identity. And when we collectively do so, we create entire subcultures around it. The ego wants to turn trauma into reason, to never be questioned. And once the ego recognizes and organizes around that, healing becomes a threat, because healing would require releasing that identity. And the ego built around that wound. And that can feel terrifying, not because people love suffering, but because the familiar, even the painfully familiar, can feel safer than the unknown. Real healing requires courage, not performance, not aesthetics, not vocabulary, courage. Courage to say, this happened to me, this shaped me, and I am still responsible for how I participate in the world. That is agency. That is personal sovereignty. That is responsibility. So today, do not just ask yourself, what happened to me? That is an important question and a big shift to what's wrong with me. But go deeper. Ask, what identity did my ego build around what happened to me? Is that identity helping me, or is it helping me to remain familiar? Because the ego is an incredibly deceptive intelligence. It knows how to use pain to preserve itself. It knows how to make protection feel like wisdom. It knows how to make defense feel like selfhood. But the deeper self wants something else: integration, coherence, relationship, through breath and presence, so that we may discover real truth. The deeper self says, I will honor what I survived, but I will not worship the wound. I will care for the pain, but I will not build my entire identity around it. I will acknowledge what shaped me, but I will also take responsibility for that. Is the path, not egoic identification, but a coherent transformation through daily practice. Speaking of daily practice, I'd like you to find some time with your journals today. Explore some questions. What survival patterns have begun to feel like identity in my life? And what would it look like to honor? And then ask yourself this: what things am I identifying with that continue to wound me? What is it that culture says is not wounding, but is actually harming me? Because ego, that deceptive intelligence, does not just reside in our individual minds. It resides also in our collective. How have we culturally and collectively created behaviors, engagements with technologies that we're told, and we tell each other, are entertainment, are normal? This is the way the world is now, but are actually deeply, constantly, ongoingly harming us. Go into our breath work. Our breath work is an important practice. It might seem subtle. It might seem like it may not even feel like it's doing anything, but it's a deeply coherent practice. That's that simple practice of engaging your autonomic nervous system through intentional breath is teaching your nervous system, your brain, to create patterns towards coherence, so that when you find yourself in those moments, you can breathe into a wider range of cognition, of emotional regulation. We're targeting our heart, so I'm placing my hand over my heart, and we're going to create a gratitude list as we go so that we can connect the heart intelligence with our mind intelligence. So what we're going to do is we're going to breathe in first through our nose, deep breath, exhale with a sigh, breathe in again, exhale with a sigh, more breath than you inhaled. Now let's create our pattern. Inhale through your nose for about 5 or 6 seconds. Exhale through your mouth. That pattern going. Now let's begin a gratitude dinner. Thankful for the day. Thankful for the sunrise. Thankful for the opportunities today brings. Thankful for my support system. Keep your gratitude going. Let it expand. Keep the pattern going. If you get distracted, come back to your breath and your gratitude. Let your gratitude become incredibly detailed or explain the identity your ego built. But healing is the practice of becoming more than what happened to you. Take a breath. I'll see you tomorrow morning at 5:30.